today. And I'm Annie McKinley. I'm a speech instructor here at NIC, and I'll be the facilitator for the panel today. And starting from your right over there, we try to keep the people in the same as your program, so you'll kind of be able to follow along who's who here. We have Tom Flint, who is the chair of the NIC Social Sciences Division. We have Dr. Charlie Glock, retired professor of sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. We have Michelle Clausen, president of NIC's chapter of Phi Theta Kappa. We have our special guest, James Randi, also known as the Amazing Randy. We have Rocky Owens, president of the Associated Students of NIC. We have Ms. Lee Ray, community activist. Ms. Kelly Shifley, director of North Idaho Relations. And Don Sprague, NIC Psychology Department. What we're going to do is we're going to give the panel each 5 to 7 minutes to respond to Mr. Randy's presentation or things that have been happening during the week or other speakers, and then we'll open it up for audience's questions. So Tom, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Annie. I first of all want to say that I tremendously enjoyed your presentation today. It was most interesting and entertaining as well. And it caused me to begin to think again about an issue that has intrigued me for a number of years, which is the peculiar kind of relationship or psychology or mentality that people have towards science. Let me see if I can explain to you what I'm driving at. There's a peculiar sort of ambivalence where people, on the one hand, feel like science can do almost anything, and on the other hand, science is limited and...
Tom, excuse me, they can have a seat back there. We have about a stand issue.
Stand? Okay. I'm reminded of Arthur C. Clarke's third law of technology, where he states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, or perhaps in this case, conjuring. In other words, once something gets beyond the realm of people's understanding, they relate to it as if various kinds of miracles were being performed. Genetic engineering, computer science, lasers, all of these kinds of sciences and the technologies that spin off from it are so far in advance of the average person's knowledge that it seems almost miraculous to us that we can go to the moon and do the various things that we do, which tends to cause people to think that science can do anything. It can solve all of our environmental problems. Whatever is going wrong, science will somehow or other take care of it. We can go to the stars even though this is perhaps quite unlikely for various reasons. So on the one hand, there's this sort of invincibility the science can do orientation that people have towards science and technology. On the other hand, as Dr. Randi pointed out today, science makes mistakes, sometimes rather outrageous and foolish mistakes in terms of their descriptions and interpretations of what's going on. And of course, it's often noted that science is limited in terms of how much it does know, and that we just assume that there are things that it can't know and it won't know. So on the other hand, we tend to often reject science and the things that it says about the world, and that somehow or other will overcome these these limitations that are imposed on science will again make us be able to do things, even though it in effect flies in the face of what is actually possible according to modern scientific accounts of the world. So you have the peculiar situation of people walking around believing both, that science and technology can do or know anything and figure out all of our problems, And that on the other hand, it's also severely limited and wrong in terms of UFOs and afterlife and the things that it can't know. And which way it is at any particular moment seems to depend on what it is that someone wants to believe. And I was wondering if Dr. Randi would comment on this peculiar conflict or paradoxical attitude that people sort of have towards science and what it can and cannot do.
Yes. Oops. Hello. Yep.
Hello, that's better. First of all, I'm not a doctor. I have no academic credentials whatsoever, so I come here today absolutely unencumbered by them. I'm independently smart. And that's been described in different terms too. But I don't have any dean to explain to in the morning if I say something totally outrageous, which I probably will any moment. I think we have to differentiate, too, between science and technology. Differentiation that's often not known. I've always accepted that science is not a set of rules, it's not a set of findings or facts and figures. It is instead an ongoing search for knowledge of the universe around us. A most worthy quest, but it's not, as many people suspect, many laypersons suspect it is some sort of a religion, which has a dogma that says this absolutely is so and can never be reversed and is not subject to adjustment or revision. That's the beauty of science. It is constantly subject to revision based upon the presentation of better or more complete data and different findings. But technology is merely the application of science. And I think that's what takes us to the moon and might eventually take us to the stars, so that's a great leap of the imagination as to how we're ever going to manage that, but I leave that to future generations. I don't think we have to worry about it much. As long as we can get by this tax period in the next election, that'll be much more than going to the stars, I really suspect. However, I think that we really don't, in my experience, and this is generally around the world, not only in America, but particularly here in America, we don't really acquaint children at a very early stage, early grade school, at about this high, with the notion of what science really is. It's looked upon, even by teachers, as something, well, someday we'll get into the heavy stuff called science. No, we use science every day. When you bake a cake or you mix lemonade, you're using science, you're using an organized body of knowledge of how much lemon can get in there and how much sugar without puckering you up completely and making it totally inedible. That is, in its primitive form, science. It is a very primitive form of chemistry, if you will, or culinary science, but nonetheless, we're using an established body of knowledge and the experience and reference material in order to learn how to make lemonade, a simple thing like that, and kids learn that very early on if they have access to lemons, and the appropriate tools with which to mix the lemonade. And they are actually using science at that point and don't recognize it. And I also think that very early in science training, the episode of the N-rays that I referred to earlier, I couldn't go into all the details on that, but the details are really far-reaching in so many ways, and yet science doesn't seem to have learned from it. Just to add to that, to show you how little they've learned from it, I actually delivered a lecture very much like what you saw today, though a little bit longer and a little more technically, at the University of Nancy in France. And standing at one side of the stage was a bronze bust of René Blonlot, the man that had made this dreadful error generations before. And when I talked to them about N-rays, it was, "Zut alors, qu'est-ce que c'est ça?" They had never heard of N-rays, and I was in the very building where N-rays were discovered back in 1903, or not discovered, or undiscovered, or whatever you want to say about it, where they were said to have been discovered and something that never existed in the first place. And as I said to the Larousse, it's the only encyclopedia in the world that doesn't contain a reference to them. So scientists in general, many scientists I speak to have never heard of N-rays. Prominent French scientists even have never heard of N-rays. And I think it's a failing of our educational system that very early on we don't grab kids and say, now we're going to tell you about a wonderful thing, it's a study called science. And this is what it really is. Because they get to the high school stage and even into college without really understanding what science is all about. And your point is very well taken. It is a gross misunderstanding, and more's the pity.
Well, stimulated by a talk with which I find little to disagree, except that it didn't cover quite the whole universe. If one listens to Mr. Randi, one finds that he is talking about myth-making, essentially, and that essentially he's claiming, and I think he's correct, that we, insofar as many of these psychic phenomena are dealing with myths. But if one extends it, we are actually dealing with myth in a much broader way than just with regard to psychic phenomena. In fact, all of society is organized around myths. In fact, one of our myths in America is that we are capable of extended free will. In other words, we believe that as individuals we have powers of choice, that what happens to us is ours to decide, to a large extent. Now, there's nobody that can prove that free will exists. This is a long debate in philosophy. Science is not able to demonstrate that free will actually exists. But in order to live, in order to function, we accept it as true. Otherwise, you wouldn't know how to live your daily life. So that as one reflects on the way people make myths, there are some myths we don't like and other myths that we accept. And the ones that we accept, well, that's the way it is. We don't even think about whether we have free will or not. We just act as if we have it. And my sense is that many people get involved in engagement with faith healers or with psychics, that they are also in the process of finding a way to cope with their own worlds, and that one way to do it is to accept some of these ideas. I happen to have only one book in my library that dealt with psychic phenomena, and this was a study done in California on what people believe about psychic phenomena, astrology, and that sort of thing. In general, an enormous number of people in the Bay Area believe in ESP, in talking with dead people after they're dead. And one of the findings in the study is that the more marginal you are, that is to say, the more that the society hasn't treated you well, the less privileged you are, the more likely you are to accept these kinds of beliefs. So that if you're highly educated, you've been well treated by the world, these beliefs are less significant. Which suggests that for many people, these beliefs are serving some function. So I certainly agree that to get at the frauds is a worthwhile endeavor. On the other hand, in the process of getting at them, you also have to recognize that they are serving some important functions for people, and somehow one has to deal with the dysfunctions of exposing them. Anyway, I think I've implied a question or two there, so I'll stop at this point.
I'll agree that people do have a great need for this sort of thing. Many people have said to me, they continue to believe, there's sort of this cognitive dissonance, they will ignore all the evidence simply because they want to believe, and it's more than that, they need to believe. Some of them to the point where they will totally reject, as I say, the strongest evidence against what they tend to believe in. The story of the lady who looked at the TV set and said, well, I'm sorry, that's not the way it happened, was the greatest lesson I ever had in that particular respect. I didn't believe that a woman who was paid millions, literally millions of dollars per year to represent this particular network could look at the TV set and make that statement, when she knows that that is an unedited tape that her studio itself had produced for her perusal in order to prove this point to her. But there is a function for it, and I think it's unfortunate that there is a function for this, that people have to have Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, all of these things in order to make their lives complete. It may be too late at a certain point for these people to do the switch over to a real world which threatens them. Because they don't understand what science brought us the atom bomb, and radiation, and poison in the atmosphere, and pollution in the groundwater, and PCPs, and all that sort of thing. Well, technology brought us that, it's true, but it didn't bring us that for that purpose. It brought it to us because of initial ignorance about the circumstances that surrounded the production of these materials and the perfection of this technology. It's true, but it wasn't done purposely. And I think that people get the idea that there is some sort of a large cabal out there, there's some sort of a scheme going on. It's all the way from earthquakes down through the Kennedy assassination and into the groundwater, that everybody's out to get them, the small folks. And therefore they need some sort of protection. But what do we do most of our lives? Now, I just don't know an amateur philosopher in this respect, but it occurred to me many, many years ago, what do we spend most of our lives doing? And I think the answer is gaining control over the world around us. Now think about that for a minute. In one way or the other, I don't mean power, I mean just control, enough to be able to handle it from day to day. Pay the rent, the electric company, the phone company, and such. And complain about things that aren't working the right way, get our neighbors to cooperate with us by not mowing down the hedge every 3 weeks. Various things that we have to try to manipulate around us, gaining control of our environment so that we can live comfortably with us. Then we get to be Noriegas and something and want to rule the whole world with it. That's a different matter altogether. But just most of our efforts are in that direction. And that gives rise to things like religions, for example. There must be a superior being or gods or demons or something that are controlling the whole destiny of this species I belong to, and particularly me. And if I can get the right kind of incantation, the right kind of prayer, or learn how to sacrifice something to these gods, whatever they may be, then they'll go my way. They'll give me a break, and I'll be able to function with them, at least keep them from blasting me with lightning or giving me a terrible skin rash or whatever, or blowing me away in some way or another. It seems to be a search for magic, because magic is control of the environment. It's an attempt at control of the environment. And science obviously started out as magic. If you do these various ceremonies, you do these things, then the beast won't be able to get at you. They can't come through iron bars, they can't come through rocks and such, so if we put up the magical rocks, the beast won't be able to get at us and take a piece out of us in the middle of the night. It's all a matter of a mixture of magic and science and pure orneriness, if you want, to try to defend yourself against nature. And I find it scary that we can't really tell the difference between these things. But again, in summary, our lives are largely devoted to trying to manipulate and control the world around us to protect each one of us and those important to us from the ravages of nature and time and weather and such. And I think that our search for magic is a search for that. And the magic sounds easy, because you cross the pond with silver, then I give you advice that enables you to do the following. And since you're a Scorpio, it will work this way. I might add that I simply don't believe in astrology for a very good reason. I'm a Leo, and Leos are very hard to convince of things like that.
As a student here at NIC, I'd just like to say how important this convocation or the symposium has been to me. It has brought up a lot of questions and it's really sparked my curiosity. I know that as a smaller college, we don't have a lot of interesting things happening here. I mean, as a student, this is something that has brought everyone together, something that everyone's curious about. It's a very important subjects, I should say. And I think it's really good for everybody to be able to talk about it and think about it and learn more about it, even though whether it's true or not, it's very important to study things that are unknown to us. Also, last night I got an opportunity to talk to Dr. Moody, the speaker for yesterday's symposium, and he was talking about consciousness and how it's what we are conscious of is only what we allow ourselves to be conscious of. And there might be a lot of other things out there, that we are not conscious of because we're not allowing ourselves to be. Just think about it, your everyday, day-to-day thing, like work 9 to 5, or if you go to school and you come home, you have things to do, you might sit down and watch TV or do your homework. How much of that day do you remember? Do you remember the little boy who walked by you that day who was wearing a funny looking hat, or the new flowers that were growing beside the building of your classroom? Or do you remember the smiles that you saw, or maybe something that your teacher said that was really important. How much do we remember? How much do we pay attention to? And he was saying that to a large extent, what we remember and understand and take to be what we're conscious of is what we allow ourselves to be. And I think it's very important for everyone to stop and smell the roses and to make use of the time that they have. You're not going to be here again. You're not going to have this day, this year, this part of your life back again. And it's really important to appreciate what you've been given and what you have, what you've accomplished. You're here because you've accomplished a lot. I also would like to make a comment to Mr. Randi, and I really appreciated the humor that he used in his speaking to the audience. It really brought them into what he was saying and really made it kind of a comfortable situation. They felt comfortable with him. I know I did. And also him showing us a little bit of magic and stuff, and showing us how he did one of the tricks. I've never seen an explanation of a trick before, and I was really impressed, and I really snagged my attention. I don't really know what to think about all these phenomena and UFOs and life after life, but it's something to think about. And I don't think anybody, like as far as the speakers that we've had, they don't really have the answers. I don't know if anybody ever will. But if we keep thinking about it, keep that part of it in our mind, we can never go wrong. Curiosity is very important. It keeps you alive. Thank you.
Well said. Very well said. I forgot, Tom, I've got to mention something to you about Arthur C. Clarke. His saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is, to a person unacquainted with it, magic. Not or conjuring, as you added. Conjuring is purposeful deception for purposes of approximating the effect of magic. So take conjuring out of that. I want to be removed from that. Arthur also gave me something to say. He was at the United Nations one time, invited me along to a talk, and it took me until I paid him a second visit in Sri Lanka a couple of years later, and I said, remember your comment? And I quoted it. And he said, I know, you want to use it. And I said, yeah, I want to use it. I've already used it. And he said, yeah, I heard you did. He gave me this wonderful quote. He said, I think sometimes parapsychologists have been educated far beyond their intelligence. Think about that. I think it's a wonderful quote. No, what's just been brought up by Michelle, I think is extremely important. But you've got to remember one thing. It is part, I think, of human existence under the function of the human mind not to remember everything. I'll give you all a little experiment to do right now, you folks in the audience. You folks here can do the same experiment. Pay attention. It's a simple experiment, but I think it'll teach us, and you may remember this for a long time. I want you all to look at the good-looking gentleman on the end in the blue. Don't get carried away, just look at him. Okay, you've seen him now, you're focused in on him. Okay, now look at Tom over here. Okay? Hey, question. Did you see me in between? No. You saw me with your eyes, but your brain didn't. Because when you went like this to this, you didn't close your eyes. What you did is you looked and you said, okay, now I'm instructed to go over here, shut off. Turn on again. And that's exactly what you did. You didn't see what happened. And now we magicians know that. We know it, and we absolutely revel in it. We know that you cannot see when you switch like that. You don't see what's in between. It scans across your retina. Yes, but it's like watching a motion picture in which suddenly someone turns the camera very rapidly and go, whoa, because you weren't ready for it. This time you've got feedback. You know you're going to do this, and you must shut off in between, or you get this terrible, blurry, stunning image where you would have to reel. So there are things that you don't notice and you don't remember, and your mind has to select those things out and reject a great number of them. Now, when the magicians are doing the magic trick, you leave out most of it. If the magician just casually does this kind of a thing, and then takes his hand back out again, you don't notice that. You didn't notice things that I did on stage today. Certain simple things that are part, apparently, of my action. If I asked you to reconstruct them, you couldn't. Because you simply cannot store all of this information. I can tell you, when you get to be 63, you start to back up and dump out some of the stuff at the other end. Sometimes you dump out stuff that was only an hour ago or yesterday. But you just can't accommodate all that sort of thing. Yes, it's too bad we don't have total memory of all those delicious things. That little kid with the funny hat is the kind of thing that I might like to remember, but I don't necessarily. Maybe it's stored someplace. I don't really know how that functions. Maybe it is stored someplace. I haven't got an immediate recall, but it's on the hard drive someplace, way in the back there. But remember that we really have to discard a great deal of that. If you don't, we magicians simply can't continue to work, and that's all there is to it.
There you go.
Mr. Randi, I want to thank you for coming to NIC. I know you're in great demand around this country, and I just want to thank you personally for coming to our college. And I also would like to thank you for not losing your sense of humor. Lauren Coleman the first day said we cannot lose our sense of humor when examining these things, and you certainly have not lost yours. I would like to read two comments to you, or statements that were made by Lauren Coleman on Monday, and you can comment on these after I finish with my other questions. He knows what kind of questions. He heard them last night. 20%, he's commenting on the phenomenons of mysterious places. 80% of the reports are unexplained phenomenons or hoaxes or mistakes, but 20% are hardcore reports that are just totally unexplainable. And then he says further, I don't really believe any of this, but I accept that people have real experiences. Something is out there. These are real people. They have real experiences. I kind of concur with that latter statement, that people do have real experiences. It's just they're unexplainable in different ways. I'm going to be recapping a couple of quotes this week, and if he cares to tear them apart, he can. Dr. Moody said yesterday, there's a fine line between an open mind and a closed mind. And I believe that's true because there's certain elements that you can't take for granted, but at the same time you have to be open up to new ideas. I also think many times people see things from an egocentric or ethnocentric point of view. They don't see it that other people have a different viewpoint on things. I'm talking particularly culture here. People will obviously not see the same object in the same way. So I think there's a degree of egocentricity there. I have three questions. And assuming that physical laws govern all phenomena, everything in nature, is it possible that physical laws are a false assumption on our part? Obviously physics is a force, it's a natural force. Is it possible, that certain objects are driven by spirits? I'm not weird or anything, but is it possible that certain obstacles, the force of gravity, it comes from the center of the earth, but how do we know that there's not some spirit down there pulling everything together as a force? Second, how valid do you think lie detectors are? And what's the limit of people's imagination, is my third question. And do you think there should be a class on imagery or studying the imagination? Thank you.
Haven't given me enough to answer. I'll get you later. I'd like to go over that quote again. I believe that people have real experiences, Coleman said. Something is out there. These are real people. They have real experiences. I would like to amend that statement, and perhaps Lauren would agree with me. People report that they believe they have real experiences. Is essentially the same statement, and it may be more correct. I'm going to give you an example. I could stand here if it had not been for a certain amount of fortuitous evidence that presented itself immediately afterwards. I could stand here and tell you that I had a genuine out-of-body experience, that from all descriptions and from my own personal experience and memory of it, had to be an out-of-body experience. There's no other explanation for it. So let me tell you about that briefly. I had returned, Jackson word, things happen like that when I'm being photographed. No explanation for it. That must be supernatural. I had returned from doing a magic show out of town one Saturday, very, very late at night. I arrived home at my home in New Jersey to find the usual situation. My foster son Alexis was seated in the kitchen, and he had brought out the beer, and I had two visiting magicians who were staying for the weekend, unknown to me, but my home is sort of a flop house for itinerant magicians who are passing through town. I call it the Randi Motel now, and they had decided to stay overnight. I came in all beat up and whatnot and tired from a long, long, arduous drive, very sleepy, and I said, okay guys, you're going to sit up and drink up all my beer, that's fine, I'm just going to bed. So I headed to the bedroom, flopped into bed, and of course as soon as I hit the bed I couldn't go to sleep. You know the experience. And I lay awake staring at the ceiling like this. So I turned on the TV at the foot of the bed and I sort of propped myself up, and pretty soon I fell asleep. That works. The program might have been boring, I don't know, but whatever it was, I went to sleep. The next morning I woke up, struggled out of the bedroom into the kitchen. These guys had meanwhile gone to sleep, and they were now eating off my groceries. Aside from drinking my beer, they were having breakfast. And so I sat down, joined them in a cup of coffee, hardly had half a cup of coffee in me before I sat bolt upright, looked around the table, I said, hey guys, I think last night I had an out-of-body experience. My foster son Alexis looked at me and said, sure, you had an OBE, did you? I said, well, listen to this. I said, I remember I turned on the TV, there was a program on, I sort of watched it for a while, fell asleep, and after that I woke up and I was up against the ceiling, spread out like this, sort of floating up against the ceiling, looking down, seeing the bed. The room was illuminated with this sort of grayish light. I heard the coming from the TV set that was lighting the room, and Alice, that was my black cat at the time, was curled up in the middle of my bed, of course. And I was scrunched over to one side. You wouldn't want to disturb a cat while she's taking over the bed. And I was scrunched way over one side, and I could see myself in bed, with my head on the pillow. And I remember distinctly because Alice has these chartreuse green eyes, and I had this sort of green cover on the bed. And when she opened up her eyes and looked up at me up against the ceiling, as I'm floating there looking down at her and at myself in the bed, it almost looked like it punched a hole right through her head. You were seeing the bedspread right through her. I remember the color of her eyes was the same as the color of the bedspread. What a weird experience. And then I don't remember anything after that, and I woke up this morning. Now that sounds like an out-of-body experience. It's exactly a classic description of what happens. You remember these specific details, and you see yourself on the operating table, in bed, whatever. So Alexis looked at me and said, well, I got a couple of things that might get rid of that for you. And I said, what do you mean, get rid of that? I had an out-of-body experience. Whether it was a real experience or not, I certainly experienced it very, very strong, and I remember it in great detail. So we went down to the foot of the stairs and came up with a big transparent plastic bag, and inside it was the laundry. Of course, when I'm away, they accumulate laundry for about 2 weeks. And there was the chartreuse-colored bedspread. I immediately sprinted for the bedroom and saw that they had on the bed, on my bed, which I'd slept on last night, there was this terrible hunting scene thing that somebody gave me years ago. I hate it. I put it in the back of the cupboard. I only use it when the other one's in the laundry, and then I hope no one sees it. It's just a dreadful thing. And it's got this hunting scene on it. That had been on the bed, not the chartreuse bedspread. And he said, now look out on the patio. And I stood up and looked out the window on the patio. There was Alice, the cat, not very happy at being put out of the house. And he said, I had to put her out of the house yesterday afternoon when Harry, one of the magicians, arrived, because Harry's allergic to the cat. And what I had to do is I had to stick her outside. She's been out all night. She wasn't in the house last night. So I had two strong pieces of evidence that the out-of-body experience had happened entirely inside my head. Now I'm pointing this out to you because if I didn't have those two bits of evidence against it being a genuine out-of-body experience, I would now have to stand before you and tell you that that's exactly the situation. So you see that sometimes these things are so real. When Warren says these people have experiences, no, they believe strongly, and all the evidence indicates to them that the experiences were real. That doesn't mean that having the experience of having the experience means that it really was a genuine phenomenon. Certainly it could have happened entirely inside your head, as it did with me in this particular incident. What was your second question? Go to the book.
Like on the physical, false assumptions of the physical forces.
Yeah, okay. Gravity doesn't work because it's a warp of space, time, and that sort of thing. It works because there's a monster down there drawing things down. Okay. Not a bad question. No, it's a sensible question, and it's a question that's been asked for generations. Why do we come to the conclusion about these monsters under the ground? Because it's a simple explanation. We can understand that. We can't understand the warping of space-time and such, and the fact that gravitational forces actually do change. For example, the moon, in going around the Earth, is actually traveling in a straight line, would be traveling in a straight line, were not the gravitational effect of the Earth there. It's effectively traveling in a straight line relative to the gravity field of the Earth, but it appears to us to be in an eccentric orbit, a circular or elliptical, orbit around the Earth. That's pretty hard to understand. It's much easier to say that there's a big string passing to it, and the moon is being whirled around, or there's a monster down there that's going, pulling in on everything. And that is an easy explanation, but hold on a second. Is there any evidence for the monster? Yes, the phenomenon of gravity. But must we invoke some sort of a being, a creature, an entity of some kind that is consciously doing this sort of thing? It's a case of parsimony. Parsimony is a very simple principle in philosophy and is used in science all the time. It simply says that, it's Occam's razor as well, after Sir William of Ockham, who a long time ago came up with this wonderful concept that if you have two answers to a question or a problem, and one of them is very complicated and requires that you invent something to account for it, and you have to fly in the face of all other forms of reasoning that have led you to the point where you are now in order to accommodate it, and the other explanation is simple and direct. The simple, direct solution is probably the correct one. Probably, not necessarily, but probably it's much more likely to be the correct solution. He says, do not unnecessarily multiply entities, which is a fancy way of saying, don't invent stuff unnecessarily if simpler means will explain it. And since we know in physics various things, and certainly through relativity, we are taught how gravity can work, and it's all congruent with what we already know. To then invent a gravity monster that is pulling us down towards the center of the Earth is unnecessarily multiplying these entities or inventing things that we don't necessarily need in order to accommodate a good explanation of what's happened. That's one great. What was your third question?
Okay. Is there a limit of our imagination? How much do we fantasize? Like, what's it?
Is there a limit to our imagination? Depends on who you are. If you're Jean Dixon, no limit. She can imagine things that will never happen endlessly. You know that in 365 predictions made in a 5-year period, she was right on 4? Those are all the recorded predictions she made in a 5-year period in the tabloids. Right on 4. That's slightly better than 1% success average. And one of those predictions was great medical breakthroughs this year. Wow, how did she know? That's an astonishing thing. She also said that that there would be flying saucers in 1974 would land on the White House lawn, and in 1978 we'd go to war with Red China. Remember Red China? Yes, we'd go to war with Red China, atomic bombs, the whole thing, etc., etc. We forget about all those things. We remember the 4 out of 365 that she got correct, and she tells us so. She didn't predict the assassination of Kennedy, by the way, despite what you may think, but I haven't got time to get into that right now. Maybe a little later if you want to ask a specific question about it. Is there any limit to our imagination? I don't quite understand the question.
Well, like, you know how you're talking about fantasies?
Yeah.
You should fantasize to a limit. What's that limit?
There's no limit to what point you can fantasize. Science is supposed to work. I'll tell you how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to observe the facts, based upon the facts, develop a theory, and then try to disprove your theory. Not prove it, disprove it. If you can't disprove it, then it stands, as long as it is replicable by independent authorities who have equal skill in doing it. That's not quite the way science works. Hey, penicillin didn't look around and say, I want to find out something that inhibits the growth of germs. No, what he did was he prepared some Petri dishes and noticed that when there was moldy bread in the laboratory that the germs didn't grow as well. He said it might be connected with the moldy bread. Indeed it was. Penicillin was discovered. Intuition, observation, yeah, just noting things, and also it's called getting lucky along the line. So science doesn't quite work according to that. And fantasizing is very much a part of a scientist's life, as long as he recognizes that it is fantasy, and he can reduce some of that fantasy and use it as a tool to discover actual facts about the world around him. I hope there are no limits to our imagination, but as long as we realize that we are living that fantasy life, and don't forget it, because otherwise you're going to spend all your money on the lottery, and that's not a very good investment, let me tell you.
Next.
It's really good to see everyone attending the seminars really well and in numbers, and I wanted to congratulate Rocky and Melissa. I think they're a fine example and representation of the students that we have here at North Idaho, and believe me, I feel real comfortable knowing that we have students like this coming up to take care of us in the future. So at the end, I think they deserve a well-rounded applaud. My name is Lee Ray, and I'm listed as a community activist. I'm not sure what that really means.
Troublemaker.
Right. I've been with him at dinner last night, and we had a few good times together. But
Hey, watch it. Where's your guy? Where's Tom?
he's right here. If you mean by community activist, that when I get out of bed in the morning, I have to activate some muscles in my body to do that, and sometimes it's harder than others. And yes, which makes all of you in the audience community activists. I think what we're talking about here today are possibilities and interpretations of those possibilities. And we've certainly had some excellent speakers all week, and I've seen 4 of them. I missed Wednesday, the speaker on Blackfoot, or Bigfoot, excuse me. Maybe there are black. What I haven't heard addressed by Mr. Randi in his casual conversation last night and today is the paranormal, if that's the word you want to call it, occasions that come to individuals who experience them not for monetary gain or not as having control over someone else. And I myself have had some experiences in that. And so I will share that with the audience, and then I would like you to address, in all seriousness, my presentation. And a minute ago we had a lady here that took a photograph of Mr. Randi, and the flash didn't go off, and that was almost like one of those paranormal lead-ins for what I'm about to say. I had a favorite uncle when I was a small child. He had no children of his own. He and his wife really chose me as to be their daughter. And he gave me my little nickname as a child. I didn't see him much after I was grown up, but a few years ago he came through Idaho, and he came by to see my husband and I. And it had to be 30 years since I had seen this man. And he said I couldn't come through Idaho without coming by and seeing my favorite little niece. And that really touched me. We had a very nice short visit with him. That was in the summer. Later that year, it was November, my husband and I had traveled to Texas to be with his family down there for Thanksgiving. And one morning we were all having breakfast together. There were probably 6 of us sitting at the table. Now, how many of you had your photographs taken with a flash camera, and you experienced the phenomena of not really being able to see real well afterwards? You see just something blinking up here. It takes a minute or so for that to go away. You know, that's a real phenomenon because your eye has been exposed to a blast of light all of a sudden. We were sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast, and I experienced some flashing over here. And I was eating, and I went to reach for something, and that's when I saw this flashing. And I thought I might have an eyelash or a piece of lint in my eye, and it kept going. So I just looked at what was flashing, and I saw 2 distinct designs or figures. So I got up from the table, went over to the bar, took a piece of paper and pencil, and drew what I saw. And my husband was going, what is she doing? We're in the middle of breakfast. She's getting up and writing something down. So he came over there and he said, what's going on? And I said, I'll explain this later, but I just want you to see what I'm doing. Okay, he's been a really good sounding board for me. So I wrote this down, showed it to him, and left it laying on the counter. We went about our business the rest of the day. We'd gone shopping and doing things like that. And when we came in later on that afternoon, it was what, 3 or 4? 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my mother-in-law said, she came to me as we walked in the door, and she said, "Oh, honey, I've got some really bad news for you." And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, we just got a call that your uncle died today." And I said, "What time was that?" And she said, "I'm not sure, but it was this morning sometime." And I said, "What did he die from?" And they said, "A heart attack." Now I have drawn here what I saw in that blinking light, and I would like to show it to you. Now it's just 2 lines, kind of like double lines. I don't know if that's dark enough for y'all to see it in the back. Okay, that was blinking on and off several times, just kind of like a neon light. And then the second design I saw was this, with the line right through it. And so when I called my mother after getting the news, and I asked her, you know, what happened, and she said he had cardiac arrest, blockage of the vessels, and he died at 9 a.m., exactly when I was seeing this phenomenon. Now, I didn't get that for any benefit of anyone. I truly believe that this was some way connected to him telling me that, you know, he's no longer here. And the other comment I have to make is if someone goes to a psychic to contact a departed friend or loved one, and they pay the money, and then the psychic says, "Well, I've heard from your loved one and everything's okay, don't worry about it." Okay, that's one of the things that we've addressed. I would like to know what the difference is if you go to a counselor for bereavement because you can't adjust to the fact that your father died and you didn't get there 10 minutes before he died, you didn't get to see him, and so you grieve and you carry this guilt. Why weren't you there? You're paying the psychiatrist, and he will say the same thing to you. It's okay, you couldn't help it. So in some cases, there may be a legitimate use of this kind of thing. So if you'd like to address that, I appreciate it.
Surely. I'll take the last one first, if I may. Yes, obviously there is a potential for some value in going to see a psychic in the same way that you might go to see a psychiatrist, and frankly, I'm not a great fan of psychiatry. I think that's just sort of a borderline study or science or art or whatever. I've known Freudians who will talk to you for days until they get you to admit that your mother enters into the thing, and then it's a victory for them because they got to have mother in there someplace. I never had a mother, so they have a hard time with that. But my brother was an only child too, so I can't wait. I can't wait. You know, it's very true. I think that psychics, in that respect, do serve a function. But my objection to it is simply this: that the counselor, the experienced counselor who is not promising any supernatural or paranormal explanation, does not leave you with the kind of burden that the psychic will leave you with. The psychic leaves you with the burden of adopting a magical way to look at your world. People have said to me, what harm is the astrological column in the newspapers? Oh, it's beside the comic strip. It's right by Calvin and Hobbes, and it's not all that dangerous. But it can be, because that is the thin edge of a very substantial wedge that can separate you from your emotional stability and your sanity in some cases. If you begin to believe in any kind of a magical way of approaching life by throwing salt over your shoulder or doing incantations or looking at the configuration of the planets against the stars and whatnot to come to conclusions about what you should do or not do in your life, or find some way to blame the stars. Remember Shakespeare, the fault lies not in our stars but in ourselves? Well, I think it's very true. It can lead you into a magical form of thinking. And if you believe the psychics, you can go on from there to accept anything that any person with some sort of magical form of thinking can lead you to. And I think that's the danger of it. It's the different labels that it has on it. It allows you to get into the magical mode of thinking, which is not productive. The other may be more productive. I'm not all that sure, but certainly I don't think it's as damaging, potentially damaging. To go to your other question, what you're pointing out to me is that you had a peculiar physiological phenomenon of some kind, maybe very well a physiological phenomenon that occurred at the same time that something else occurred at a distance that was important to your life. You're pointing out that two events coincided. Well, two events have to coincide someplace in your life. These were an unusual event that didn't happen to you. You don't often get pictures like this in front of your eyes and that sort of phenomenon, although I've had it frequently under various, like a bad glass of vodka, I'll do it frequently, you know, and poisoned olive in a martini. That occasionally happens. But seriously, finding that there is a coincidence between two events, one important in your life and the other peculiar and something that doesn't normally happen to you, if that sort of coincidence did not occur, then you'd have to run to the papers and record it and rave about it. Coincidences must happen in your life mathematically, and to assign significance to them is not necessarily valid. I have known people who said that they went to faith healers and the faith healer touched them on the forehead. They went back to the doctor the next day and he said, your arthritis is much better, and from then on the arthritis was much better. But then I asked them at the same time, did you also change your brand of peanut butter? They say, no. But if you had changed your brand of peanut butter, would you attribute that recession of the effect of the arthritis, would you attribute that to having changed your brand of peanut butter? No, because the other was pointed out to you as being a cause, and therefore you had the effect. You have to be very careful of assigning cause and effect where there may not be any. On the other hand, there may very well be. If this sort of thing repeated enough in your life, then that would be quite remarkable, because coincidences, remarkable coincidences, have to happen every now and then. Very quickly, I'll point out one to you that happened to Lester Del Rey's wife, the science fiction writer. They used to live near me, near Red Bank, New Jersey. And they were preparing to go on a trip to Germany. And Mrs. Del Rey didn't have a birth certificate, never had her birth certificate. She was born in Georgia. And she had written away for a birth certificate. I joined them for breakfast one night, I'll be all right, keep your seats, one morning, and haven't been the same since the baby. And we were sitting at the breakfast table, mail dropped in through the door. She casually got up, and we were sitting there sipping coffee. And she went and got it. She said, oh, here's my birth certificate. Opened up the envelope, took it out, and she said, look at these idiots. Look what they've done. She gave it to me, and I said, yeah, that's pretty weird. They must have had some operator who wasn't paying attention. Because her birth certificate number was 201-577-7147, I think it was. And that was her telephone number in New Jersey, 10-digit number. But it was also her birth certificate number. Actually, believe it or not, it was the number of her birth certificate in Georgia some 52 years previously that had been given to her birth certificate. It ended up being the same with the area code and the whole thing as her number in New Jersey. An astonishing coincidence. But if coincidences like that didn't happen occasionally, then we'd have reason to go running off to the statisticians and saying, hey, look at this, no coincidences. So you can't assign a meaning to these coincidences necessarily. Incidentally, there was no meaning to that whatsoever. It just happened to be a rather remarkable coincidence. Next case.
Hi, my name's Kelly Shively, and I'm with Revelations. And I have done psychic work. I've had many experiences and worked with many different psychic healers and various people into metaphysics, I guess you could say. Primarily, I never knew of the terminologies for metaphysical until I was in my 20s. I always had experiences as a child and was raised according to which grandparent took me to their church, and didn't really figure it one way or another, figured everybody else had the same abilities or the same knowings. Was no big deal as a child, you know, if you hear things or see things or experience telepathic communications. Until I started investigating it, looking into various information, a lot of the times I would look into books and I think, well, these people are really on some kind of drug trip, because this is just not reality or things that transpire in the world in which I live in, you know. And if it happens in their world, great. Over the time of expanding or increasing my intuition or my open-mindedness or whatever terminology fits for you, my abilities or my experiences became more broadened. And whether it's a belief that I have or the experiences are true, I don't have all the answers, but I do have some of the experiences. And today I'm here to share them with you and to see what the amazing Dr. Randi has to say. And I do think that it's very important for each of us to remain open and to research it for yourself, pro and con. Because I'll be the first one to say there's a lot of charlatans out there, and don't be taken. You know, I'm a skeptic. I don't believe everything I see and everything I'm told, because there's magic, there's phenomena, there's whatever you want to call it that's unexplainable. But I think a lot of it's explainable to the point that we might not consciously understand it. You know, they didn't think that people would fly in a plane or go to the moon, but 20 years later they did. And maybe 20 years from now, we'll be sitting back looking at these videos and looking at the experiences that we had growing up, going through college and working, and be able to have them explained to us in a scientific manner. For myself, I don't really think that they're that mystical. I believe that everybody has the abilities. Those that look into it or have occasional glimpses and then later explain it away that, oh, it couldn't be that, we can't talk about it, they'll think I'm crazy, need to kind of maybe reflect inside and listen to their hearts and trust what it is for you as an individual and your own personal, unique experience and expression is. I think that it's very important to listen to the scientific community, and yeah, they make mistakes, they're human too. But they have a lot of answers, and it isn't mystical and magical or phenomenal, the things that psychic or different predictors or healers do. And I believe in time, the more they try to disprove it, they'll prove it. And I think it's all just a learning step of what we've gone through time and time again with each experience and with each technology that's come forth, you know. So I want to thank each of you for being able to have an open mind and research it for yourself. Don't take, you know, everybody's opinion and their experiences, because they're not yours, but add them to your collection. Thank you.
Can't disagree with you a great deal with that, I must say. But I have some exceptions. You went fast, I had to make notes. My plane leaves at 7:20. No, it's not okay. You point out that there are a lot of charlatans out there. Well, we recognize that, of course there are. My question is, how many of them are charlatans? My answer, given over the years, very small percentage of them. Those are the professionals, the people who purposely set out to deceive people. Most of the people, in fact, all of the people except two that have ever competed for my $10,000 prize, which was made into a $100,000 prize some years ago for a special program called the $100,000 Challenge. That $90,000 was added by the sponsor, who was in a terrible panic because he didn't understand statistics at all. He didn't realize how incredibly difficult it was for them by chance alone to beat the odds that we had set. There were millions to one in some cases, and yet he said, don't take any chances, make it billions to one, because he might be out $90,000 extra on the program. The people who present themselves to me are certainly, by and large, as I say, with only two exceptions over 24 years, people who really believe they have the powers. But my question is, why do they believe they have the powers? Because they don't really have the means to evaluate what they are doing and what's happening to them. One lady on the program is a good example. She said that when she sorted ESP cards, and we're talking about decks of ESP cards now, smaller cards, regular playing card size, that are used in ESP experiments even to this day. And she would take a deck of 25 of these, 5 of each symbol, And she said she was able to sort them out just by looking at the back of them and guessing which one was going to be which. She should get 20%, 1 out of 5, by chance alone. That stands to reason. Now, there are some things to be said about that as to whether that's the actual chance. Depending on how the experiment is conducted, the chances could be 20%, 1 in 5. And when she did it on our program, we gave her, what was it, like 400 cards or something like that. All these decks all shuffled together, and she was to sort them out. She got, believe it or not, exactly 20% correct. Right on the nose, not just a little bit either side, and a little bit either side would have been quite allowable, but she went through several things before the program. She did it all before the program and completed as the program started. It was a live program. And when we came up with the results, she was exactly chance. And yet she looked bewildered. She said, but when I do this by myself, my results are much better. We didn't find out till after the program how she had been testing herself. What she had been doing is taking a deck of 25 cards, shuffling it up, saying, I think this top one's a star. She would turn it over, I'm right, put it aside. That would be put in the right pile. Take the next one. Now, what are her chances of getting the next one right? Better, of course, because she's eliminated one. She knows the next one only has not one chance in 5 of being a star, slightly less of being a star, so she'll guess a different one. And as she goes through it, and she exposes each card, if it's wrong, she placed it face up over here. When she gets down near the end of it, subconsciously, I don't think consciously, certainly if she's gone through all the stars and all the wavy lines and all of the squares, she's going to guess the other 2 symbols as being likely to be in the last 3, and she's going to be right. Her chances soar near the end. She's actually got a much better chance, and she had been doing all of her experiments that way. So there's a prime example of someone who didn't know how to test themselves. And to evaluate your psychic experiences, or what you believe to be psychic experiences, and I don't doubt that you do, honestly, believe them to be psychic experiences, and I don't doubt that they may be psychic experiences. I have no evidence to the contrary. But how you evaluate them is a different matter altogether. You must be prepared to properly evaluate them. You used a term which I can't accept. You said there are things that are happening that are unexplainable. No, unexplained, I think, would be more accurate.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, not unexplainable. It's very easy. The difference between the 2 words doesn't seem to be very great, but not only semantically, but more importantly, rationally, and as far as its impact goes, unexplained. I can't explain Sophia Loren. She lives 11 miles away from me in Florida. That doesn't mean she's unexplainable. See, I have sort of a fantasy I'll share with you very quickly. I hate to do this, but it's confession time. And don't carry this any further, please, not to the National Enquirer. I have a fantasy that sometime late at night, it's been raining, and I'm sitting watching TV, and I yawn and stretch, ready to turn in. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly, at the door, and I say, wow, who could that be at this hour? It's 1 o'clock. Go to the door, dripping wet. Sophia Loren is standing there with an overnight bag in her hand saying, I have no place to go. This is not a prediction. It is a total fantasy, absolutely a total fantasy, thank you. A total fantasy, and I'm sure, to make it even worse, I don't think Sophia knows about it at all. She doesn't even know that I exist, I'm sure. But nonetheless, you see, we all have our little fantasies. Loch Ness Monster. That's another thing with me. I have a picture of someday some great gray, green, slimy, foul-smelling thing with lots of teeth is going to grab a whole tourist boat full of people from Texas with cameras around their necks and Panama hats and red ties and eat them up right on camera. Now, that may not happen ever, but on the other hand, wouldn't it be satisfying? Wow! I'd love to have something, not because I hate Texans or anything like that, no, it's just that they do the most talking about this sort of thing, and I'd like to see some of them shut up for a change. Now, you said something about we had no notion we'd fly in a plane. Oh, yes, we did. You see, people like Da Vinci, and probably people before him, actually tried to design things like helicopters. Why didn't they get a helicopter off the ground? It took Sikorsky to do that. They just didn't have the technology. You couldn't build it out of stretched goat skins and bamboo. As they wanted to do it, it would shake to pieces, and they didn't have the bearings and such. The idea was there, the technology was not yet available. I don't think that there is any very much of limitation to man's ability to fantasize about these things and perhaps eventually in inventing them. You said that the psychics have a lot of answers. That has not been my personal experience. It may have been yours. I have looked for those answers now, seriously, for a long, long time, and I've written 9 books, most of them about that subject. And particularly, I have dealt with, in my book, Faith Healers, with the healers. And after spending 2.5 years of rigorous searching and traveling around the world, answering claims of people who said they were healed and healers who said they had healed other people, I did not find from Oral Roberts or any of the others, the prominent people in the field, the very prominent people in the field, and the lesser lights, the Peter Popoffs and the W.V. Grants and such, I didn't find one example, and there were hundreds of them, of people that were healed. I visited the people who said they had recovered, and I'll give you just one quick example. There was a gentleman in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who advertised in W.V. Grant's mailed out thing called, Healing World or something, I forgot what it was. It was a big color brochure he mailed out to the faithful and asked for donations, of course. And he gave his last name, and it had a picture of him there. He said he was healed of diabetes. Now this is a perfect case to look up. Absolutely perfect, because he had a peculiar name, and I knew that there wouldn't be more than one of them in the Philadelphia phone book, and I was right. There was one person, and I was able to get it through information. I called him up and I said, did you indeed offer a testimony in W.V. Grant's book? And he said, oh yes, and I want to testify further to the healing of the Lord. I used to have diabetes. I said, well, I require two things. I'd need medical evidence from your doctor or some doctor who will verify that you did have diabetes and that you now no longer have diabetes. And he said, well, I'll give you the name and address of my doctor. So I copied it all down beautifully with his home number and his office number. And I thought to myself, well, I better tell the man, do you know, sir, there has never been a recorded case of diabetes being healed. It can be treated, and people can live long, useful lives by using either oral insulin substitutes or oral insulin or the injections. They can live under the threat of diabetic death. They can live very good lives for a long time. He said, oh yes, but I've been healed, absolutely healed. And I said, well, that would be the first case in recorded history, because I don't know of any other cases. And he said, well, I want to testify. Then he added something that sort of slowed me down. He said, by the way, my doctor will deny that I'm healed. I said, why? It's like being pregnant. You are or you aren't. You know, there's no in between. You're either healed or you're not. He said, well, because he's not a Christian. I said, what does that have to do with it? It's not a case of belief. You either are or you aren't. And he said, well, you see, he won't admit to it. And then something occurred to me, and I had to ask him the crucial question. I said, sir, are you still taking your medication? And he said, yes, the devil has made me keep on taking the medication, but I am healed of diabetes. I said, sir, if you were taking insulin and you did not have diabetes, you would die of diabetic shock, insulin shock. You certainly would die of it. And he said, oh, you're not a believer either. And I said, it's not a case of whether I believe. If I don't believe in the law of gravity, and I step over to that window and step out, I'm going to fall. I can say I don't believe that ut equals at plus half at squared. I don't believe in the law of gravity. I think I will still fall. I think gravity will still work for me. And he said, well, there's no sense talking to you. And he hung up the phone on me. But that's the kind of thing I was faced with all the time. I did not find one healing in the hundreds of cases I looked upon in which they swore they had been healed of these diseases, where I was able to find any doctor who would say they did have the disease. One was the throat cancer. It was wonderful. This woman said healed of throat cancer, and she had a letter from her doctor saying she now didn't have any throat cancer. I thought that's wonderful, but then I called the doctor and I said, what kind of throat cancer did she have? He said she never had throat cancer. Her mother died of throat cancer. Every time she got a sore throat during the winter, she would come to me, I got throat cancer, got throat cancer. I'd give her medication, I'd say, you haven't got throat cancer. She went to a faith healer, the faith healer laid hands on her. She went over slain in the spirit, as they say, and she got up and she wrote a letter saying, you healed me of throat cancer, and now I have a letter from my doctor saying I don't have throat cancer. But there was no evidence she had it in the first place. But you can't shake her of the conviction that she did have throat cancer, and her doctor was too nice to say that she did. So that's the kind of thing I'm faced with all the time. I'm willing to be shown. But you say that the healers have these wonderful records of being successful. I didn't see one. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It only means that 2.5 years of investigating these people, and sometimes getting to their home to interview them, and having them tell me that the man on the beer in the hall waiting for the morgue wagon to come by and pick them up is the man I was supposed to be interviewing. That happened on several occasions. You don't forget that in a big hurry, I'll tell you.
Mr. Randi, I want to congratulate you. You did you did the impossible today. You kept my 6-year-old son entertained and awake during your entire speech.
Is he sober?
I think so. I'm a skeptic. I'm a cognitive scientist, and it was refreshing to hear Mr. Randi's views. He brought up the topic of cognitive dissonance. As a master's student a great many years ago, I did research in that area. And one of the things that always fascinated me with the research, and the notion of cognitive dissonance, is that if an individual has certain dissonance ideas, they're going to resolve that. And once they resolve it, they are going to believe in the resolution even more. And University of Minnesota psychologist by the name of Leon Festinger wrote a marvelous book. We used to have it in the library. We may still have it there if it hasn't been gleaned out, called When Prophecy Fails. And in this book, Festinger and a group of researchers studied a group of people who believed that the world was going to come to an end. The Clarions had been talking through a woman, and she had been engaged in psychic writing. And the Clarions said that because of your belief, we are going to come down and we're going to take you away before we destroy the earth. And these people believed, they truly believed that this was going to happen. They gave away their homes, they gave away their money, their cars. The Clarions told them that they couldn't have any metal on them. So they went to the dentist and they had fillings removed, they had zippers removed. They eventually got together for the night when the Clarions were going to come down. And of course the Clarions didn't show up. Which is a real bummer, particularly if you give away your car and your house. So they decided that what they would do, they decided the problem was that the Clarions couldn't find them, and that they needed a signal, so they went out and back and they started this huge bonfire, and eventually 2 police officers showed up. But this group knew they really weren't police officers. These were really Clarions disguised as police officers. Well, as the night went on and the sun came up in the morning, they had to face the reality that the Clarions weren't coming, the earth wasn't going to end, and very quickly they were going to look really silly. They were already looking fairly silly, but they were really going to look silly once the papers started reporting that the earth was still here. The woman that was head of the group excused herself and went into her den, where she began to engage in psychic writing again, and came back with a pronouncement from the Clarions that because of this group's faith, the earth was going to be destroyed, or was going to be saved, that the Clarions weren't going to destroy the earth. And what was fascinating with this whole thing, and it goes along with the things that Mr. Randi has been saying, is that rather than the belief being weakened in this group, it was in fact strengthened. These people believed more than ever in the Clarions and in their particular cause. And I think, and I would like you to respond to this, I think that we see this with groups around the country, and they make certain proclamations, they make predictions, and when those predictions don't come true, we suspect that they are going to sort of go silently into the night, but in fact they don't. They seem to become even more evangelical than before.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Festinger's book, When Prophecy Fails. In fact, I referred to it in my book, The Mask of Nostradamus, which I suggest you all rush out and buy a copy of it. It's really, I'm very proud of that book. It took almost 2 years of living in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence and Salon de Provence and Marseille as well, where I was forced to eat fish every day, yummy, yummy. And I lived where Nostradamus was born and worked. And I walked down the same medieval streets that he did in Saint-Rémy, and it was an astonishing experience because I finally did uncover a great deal of the secrets of Michel de Notre Dame, a remarkable gentleman who has been magnified out of all proportion by the Nostradamus, the people who currently believe him, who rewrite his prophecies, combine 2 quatrains, form one, change the spelling, the punctuation, the capitalization in order to make things fit. And they're very clever at it, but he must be, well, I went to his grave in Salon. He's buried in the wall of the church. I put my ear up to it, and I expected to hear on the inside, but I didn't quite hear that. There are other examples of the groups that were going for the Clarions. Incidentally, I'm a Clarion. But and you're in big trouble. Big trouble.
You can tell by the eye.
Yeah, yes. You can tell. Oh, every time you can. Your view glasses aren't real tall. It's filtering out my deadly laser beam eyes. Ho, ho, ho. And, but look at the Seventh-day Adventists. The Millerites, as they were originally known. To this day, they're still saying that the Advent is coming any moment at all. They haven't given a date for it because Miller gave 3 different dates, and they all gave away everything. Sold their property, burned their house to the ground, gave up the money, canceled the insurance, the whole thing, all went up on the top of the hill with the sandals and everything and waited and waited and waited. And Miller looked down at his pad and said, oh my goodness, wait a minute, I dropped a 2 here. Hold on. And he did the calculations again. It's next year. Gee, I'm sorry, folks. And I said, whoops. Well, I can live with my sister for another year anyway. And they went home and they lived with relatives for another year. Next year they came out on the same date, stood up on top of the mountain, hallelujah, and nothing happened again. And then it happened a 3rd time, and then Miller died. He did anything to escape the further embarrassment, I think. He just upped and died, and he wasn't around to explain. But the Seventh-day Adventists are the Millerites. They've just changed their name, and they're still going strong. And I guess they're nice folks, and they do useful stuff and everything. But I think they're sadly misdirected, and they're still waiting for the 7th day to come. Of course, it may be tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I'm not sure. But there are all kinds of groups like this that are going on. Look at Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Not too far away, as a matter of fact. Ho, ho, ho. Remember, those evil influences are all around us, and they want everyone to bury themselves in underground shelters and such, and carry on. She's made all kinds of predictions about things that are supposed to have already happened. Edgar Casey. According to Edgar Casey, New York is now under the ocean. You didn't know about this. I hope you didn't own any property there. It all sank below the ocean long ago. And what, Idaho broke off or something and floated out into the sea. I've forgotten what happened, but it's supposed to have all happened by now. Well, the books by Edgar Casey on prophecy are no longer published because the prophecies, most of them, are the major ones, are supposed to have taken place and didn't. But they still publish all the other ones because they aren't prophecy, and they can go on down for the next 200 years and still continue to be sold because people will never learn. This cognitive dissonance thing is very strong, and I hope that people that I speak to begin to realize just how very strong it is. And don't think that you can't suffer from it too, when you absolutely refuse to accept the evidence that is laid in front of you. I can give you endless examples of it, but it's time that some of those folks out there, am I correct, should be able to vent their, ask questions of all of us, I guess. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah, we have time for just a couple quick questions. Do we have a question?
Yes.
I'm wanting to know about what you believe about God and your religious orientation and how you reconcile all that.
Didn't I tell you, Tony, that's always the first question. Right? Which God are you speaking about? Thor? Zeus? Who?
How do you feel about
Which God, though?
the concept?
The concept of God. No, I don't have any belief in a deity because I don't find it necessary for me to explain the world satisfactorily so that I can get along in it. Again, it's parsimony. I don't invent things necessary to explain things that I don't have any explanation for. I'm content, not satisfied, but I'm content to have mysteries that I don't have a solution for, an answer for. But that doesn't mean that I have to invent something, and I think that's what it is, frankly. That's my opinion. It may not be yours, but it is my opinion that people do invent these entities, deities and such, and mythologies in order to explain. It's very handy to say, oh, that's something only God knows. I don't have to answer that. Next question, and go on. But I don't have any religious convictions. Yeah, we've got to hurry. I've got to be at the studio in 10 minutes, but let's move quickly.
There was this faith healer came to town and had the big tent.
Yeah.
And he says, anybody out there need to be healed? And this little woman comes up on her crutches, says, I've got this terrible arthritis. Says, I'd like to get rid of these crutches. So he says, well, everybody in the audience prayed. Says, now, Mrs. Smith, you go over behind the screen over here. And then anybody else? And this little guy came up and said, my name is Samuels, and said, I've had this list, but I'd like to get rid of this list. He says, okay, Mr. Samuels, you go behind the screen. And then everybody prayed. He says, glory be. And he says, now then, Mrs. Smith, throw your crutch over the screen. He says, glory be. His crutch came over, and then another one. And then he says, now then, Mr. Samuels, say something. He says, Mrs. Smith just fell on her ass.
Heard it. Very true. Yes, you had a question.
Would you please comment on or react to magic and or conjuring, that sort of speculating on what might be involved in things like crop rings and Bigfoot?
Oh, Bigfoot, well, I think you have to look into the literature on Bigfoot. A number of people have revealed and shown even the huge plywood feet that they use to make some of the tracks in the mud. And the expert, then you read the opinion of the experts, you say, oh no, I can see clearly that it's not it's not an artificial thing because it had a so-and-so and a gracchus to it, and the distribution of the weight on the forefoot and the femur and the whole thing. They give you all this mad talk, and then afterwards they go away and say, hee, wrong again. And they feel sort of silly, and nobody really comments about it. But the crop circles have been quite well explained. As a matter of fact, I got to tell you this is a disappointing part of my life. National Geographic and I had a whole scheme going. We were going to go over to England, and I could see how crop circles could easily be made. We were going to create some when the season came. The season, by the way, is exactly the week that school lets out. No one ever noticed that before. And it stops as soon as the kids go back to school. No more crop circles. I wonder if there's a connection. I really can't figure it out. But anyway, we were going to go over there and create 2 or 3 major crop circles and then just go away and wait for them to be discovered by the believers, who would then come in and say, oh, I get the vibrations. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, they're obviously Martians. The ground is radioactive. I'm getting the terrible sensations from it. And then reveal to them, ho, ho, we made them. But then the 2 guys who had been making them for years came out and did exactly the same thing, created them for the Examiner or the Evening something or other in England, I've forgotten which, and they beat us to it. We had all the travel tickets, we had the whole thing in our pocket, ready to go over and do it on behalf of the Wessex skeptics, which is not easy for anyone to say, even if you're from Wessex. And we were going to do it on their behalf, and these guys who had been doing it for years came out and revealed the whole thing as a hoax. But now, of course, the believers are saying, but they couldn't have done all of them, which is quite true. Because remember, the very day that school let out is when they started to get crop circles. And I think there might be a connection someplace there. BBC got a whole group of kids and asked them how they would do it. They all marched out into the field and did it. And then they asked them, have you been doing this before? And they said, no comment, and wandered back to school. So I have that film at home, and it's very interesting. Crop circles, another example of how silly we can get over relatively silly things and how much time we can spend on it. We've got to go now. This man is my personal manager and agent here, and we're going to go into a TV program. Where is it?
Over across the way.
Oh, well, we haven't got far to go, but it's ready to go on the air, so rush home and tune in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Randi, and thank you for the panel.